How Vikings changed the English language. The Vikings had a large influence on the English language and were key in the transition from Old English to Middle English. The Old English spoken by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain and the Old Norse spoken by the Vikings were similar enough to allow for communication between the two groups, yet different enough that Vikings raiding and eventually settling in Britain brought drastic changes to the grammar and vocabulary of English. But who were the Vikings, and what was the long-term impact of their changes to the English language? The Vikings were Scandinavian traders and colonists who frequently turned to piracy and raiding. The word Viking means one who lurks in a bay. The Vikings who raided Britain and the British Isles came specifically from Norway and Denmark. The Vikings spoke a language that we call Old Norse. It was a North Germanic language, and probably similar to Old English. It is likely that the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in England could understand each other. There are several reasons that explain why the Vikings raided and plundered in Britain and Europe. The first of these is that around the time that the Vikings first began their invasions, the Frankish Empire was in decline, which invited raids by outside invaders. Another factor may be that overspending by Arab caliphs had caused Vikings to abandon trade in the Baltic Seas and led them to seek more violent means of accumulating wealth. The promise of treasures, as well as the need for land, may have also led to the Viking raids. There was little fertile land in western Norway, and in Scotland, the Vikings could farm and trade, as well as plunder and raid. Changes in climate also made it easy for the Vikings to travel to the British Isles and back. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the seas began to calm, and the number of summer storms decreased. In addition, the predominant winds blew westward in the spring, which would take the Vikings to the British Isles, and eastward in the autumn, which would carry their boats back to Scandinavia. Climate also led to population growth, which led to the onset of raids. The improving climate of this time, which allowed more children to survive to adulthood, as well as the Viking practices of polygamy, having multiple wives, and primogeniture, leaving one's entire inheritance to the eldest son, led to an increased number of younger sons looking for fortune and adventure. At first, the Vikings would come to the British Isles to raid and plunder during the summer, and then return to Scandinavia for the winter. Over time, they began to establish winter camps so that they could stay in Britain year-round. These winter bases evolved into permanent settlements. In 878 CE, the Anglo-Saxon king, King Alfred, agreed to a truce with Guthrum, the Viking king. Guthrum was baptized, and England was divided into the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the northern Danelaw by an imaginary line running from London to Bedford. In communities where the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived together, the relationship between the two peoples was hostile at first. The Vikings were violent, taking what they wanted by force, and through their farming, they were taking away land from the native people. Over time, though, the two groups gradually began to live peacefully alongside each other. One way of seeing the impact, influence, and distribution of the Scandinavians in an area is through place names. Many places were named for people or geographical and topographical features, so it was easy to see where there is a Scandinavian influence. One example of this is the English farming village of Skeffington. Skeft is an English name, and the suffix ton comes from Old English, but the sk sound at the beginning was a common beginning sound in Old Norse. It's possible that Skeffington was an English farming village that was then taken over by Vikings. Other suffixes that indicate Scandinavian settlement or influence are by, thwaite, and thorp. Another way that place names can be used to learn about Viking and Anglo-Saxon interactions is by looking at the original meaning of the place names. This can show what the Vikings thought of the people and landscape that they encountered in a particular place. For example, the name Lerwick means mud bay, and could have shown the Vikings' scorn of a place that they considered to be useless. The many places were influenced by the Vikings, settlements developed differently based on the context in which the Vikings came and lived. Some places, such as Dublin and Waterford in Ireland, became more urban, while settlements in Scotland tended to be more rural. There were already towns in England, but in general, when the Vikings came, they further developed these towns. Because Old English and Old Norse had a common Germanic base, they were compatible with each other, and elements of Old Norse were easily incorporated into Old English. English changed as the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings began to interact more in everyday life. Many of the words that became integrated into English from Old Norse are words that have to do with everyday tasks, because they were added gradually through interactions such as farming, trade, and eventually intermarriage and the assimilation of Vikings into Anglo-Saxon communities. This led to the development of Middle English.